$75. That was the insulting offer the renowned appraiser slapped on the velvet counter, dismissing the battered silver photograph case as a worthless modern fake. He didn't bother looking up at the 82-year-old man standing before him. But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't take the money. Instead, his trembling, calloused hands reached out, pointing to the faded tintype inside. In exactly 48 seconds, he named every single ghost trapped in that silver frame and shattered a 60-year-old government cover-up. Boston's Grand Heritage Exhibition Hall smelled of old dust, expensive cologne, and desperate hope. Hundreds of people clutched family heirlooms, waiting in snaking lines for a few seconds of validation from the country's leading antiquities experts. Elijah Pendleton stood near the back of line 4, leaning heavily on a simple wooden cane. He wore a faded olive-drab jacket that had seen better decades, his posture stubbornly straight, despite the arthritis grinding in his lower spine. Beside him, his granddaughter Clara shifted her weight from foot to foot. She had begged him to come here, just to see Grandpa, she had urged, pointing to the television ads for the touring appraisal show. You've kept that metal box hidden away my whole life. Let's just see what it is. Elijah hadn't wanted to come. The box in his heavy woolen coat pocket wasn't an antique to him. It was a tombstone. But Clara's earnest eyes had worn him down. Now, staring at the polished mahogany tables at the front of the room, he felt a familiar cold knot tightening in his chest. At the head of their line sat Dr. Alistair Covington. Covington was a man who seemed constructed entirely of sharp angles and condescension. Clad in a bespoke charcoal suit, a jeweler's loop permanently embedded in his right eye socket, Covington dismissed people with the casual cruelty of a bored monarch. Elijah watched him tell a weeping elderly woman that her prized Victorian brooch was mid-century costume jewelry, moving his hand in a shooing motion for the next person in line before she had even finished crying. "He looks awfully strict," Clara whispered, her enthusiasm waning. "He looks like a man who reads books about storms but has never felt the rain." Elijah grumbled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. When it was finally their turn, Elijah stepped up to the table. He didn't speak. He reached into his deep pocket and withdrew a dull, scratched silver cigarette case. It was unusually thick, dented on the bottom left corner, and carried a dark patina that spoke of mud and sweat rather than polished drawing rooms. He set it down on the velvet mat. The metal made a heavy, dull thud. Covington sighed a dramatic exhalation that ruffled his perfectly groomed mustache. "Cigarette cases," he muttered, mostly to his assistant standing behind him with a clipboard. "The bane of my existence. Everyone thinks their grandfather's nickel-plated junk is Romanov silver." Covington didn't look at Elijah. He picked up the case with gloved hands, his fingers flipping it over with practiced, dismissive speed. He popped the latch. The hinge squealed a harsh sound in the quiet space. Inside, protected by a cloudy piece of celluloid, was a photograph. A group of 12 young men, dressed in unmarked dark fatigues, standing in front of a dense, unrecognizable jungle canopy. Elijah felt his heart kick against his ribs. It always did when he saw them. Covington brought the case inches from his face, adjusting his loop. He spent exactly 4 seconds looking at it. Then he snapped the case shut with a sharp clack and pushed it back across the velvet toward Elijah. "Reproduction," Covington declared loudly, ensuring the people in the next line over could hear his brilliant deduction. "And not a particularly good one either." Clara blinked, stunned. "Wait, what? A reproduction of what?" Covington finally looked up, his eyes resting on Clara, entirely ignoring the old man beside her. "My dear, the market is flooded with these nostalgia pieces. People take modern tintypes, age them with chemical washes, and put them in cheap, mass-produced silver-plated brass cases to sell at flea markets. The hallmarks on the silver are completely illegible, a classic sign of a rushed forgery." "It's not a forgery," Elijah said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a dense, immovable weight. Covington offered a patronizing, tight-lipped smile. "Sir, I assure you it is. The photographic emulsion is completely wrong for the era the clothing suggests. Furthermore, look at the subjects. He tapped the closed silver case with a manicured fingernail. Military men, supposedly, yet they wear absolutely no insignia, no unit patches, no rank. Their gear is a hodgepodge of civilian and military issue. It's a fantasy piece, someone's idea of a rough-and-tumble squad, staged for a dramatic photo. It's theatrical, not historical. Elijah's hands gripped the handle of his cane. The knuckles turned bone white. The knot in his chest wasn't cold anymore. It was catching fire. "I can offer you $75, Covington continued smoothly, already looking past Elijah to the next person in line. "Solely for the scrap value of the silver plating and the novelty of the staging. Take it or leave it, sir, but please step aside. We have a very tight schedule." Clara gently touched Elijah's arm. "It's okay, Grandpa. Let's just go home. I'm sorry I brought you here." She tried to pull him away, but Elijah Pendleton did not move. He stood anchored to the floor of the Heritage Exhibition Hall, staring down at the man who had just erased the 12 bravest men he had ever known. "Grandpa, come on," Clara urged, her voice trembling slightly. People in the line behind them were beginning to murmur, shifting impatiently. Covington let out an exasperated sigh, holding out his hand to the next woman in line. "Ma'am, please step forward with your ceramics." Elijah slammed his free hand flat onto the velvet table. The smack echoed sharply, silencing the immediate vicinity. The woman with the ceramics froze. Covington snapped his head back, his eyes narrowing in genuine anger. "Sir," Covington said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, litigious whisper. "Security is standing right by the exit. If you do not clear this table, I will have you removed. Your cheap trinket is not worth my time, and it is certainly not worth making a scene." "You look at the paper, you look at the silver, you look at the missing patches," Elijah said, his voice vibrating with a suppressed fury that made Clara take a half step back. "But you didn't look at their faces." "I don't need to look at the faces of paid actors in a flea market fake." Covington shot back, his professional veneer cracking. He hated being challenged, especially by someone who looked like they bought their clothes at a hardware store. "I am Dr. Alastair Covington. I have authenticated artifacts for the Smithsonian. I wrote the definitive textbook on 20th century military photography. I know a fake when it is sitting on my table." Elijah reached out and slowly, deliberately pulled the silver case back toward him. He popped the latch again. The photograph stared up at the harsh fluorescent lights. "You wrote a book," Elijah said softly. "Congratulations. They didn't write books about where this picture was taken." A crowd was beginning to form. The hushed tones of the exhibition hall gave way to a palpable tension. Several other appraisers at nearby tables stopped their work, glancing over. A cameraman from the local news affiliate, sensing drama, quietly hoisted his rig onto his shoulder and moved closer. "This is absurd," Covington scoffed, waving to a burly security guard near the entrance. "Phil, please escort this gentleman out." "You said they have no insignia." Elijah continued, ignoring the approaching guard. "You said their gear is a hodgepodge. You're right, they didn't have unit patches because if we were caught, the United States government was prepared to swear on a stack of Bibles they had never heard of us. We wore whatever kept us alive." Covington crossed his arms, leaning back in his leather chair. The guard, Phil, approached but hesitated, sensing the charged atmosphere and seeing the camera pointing their way. "A black ops fantasy," Covington sneered. How original. Let me guess, you were on a secret mission behind enemy lines that saved the world, but the president personally asked you to keep it quiet. It's a delusion, old man. A very common one among men your age, trying to spice up their mundane service records." Clara gasped. "How dare you speak to him like that?" Elijah held up a hand, silencing his granddaughter. He didn't look at Covington anymore. He looked down at the photograph. His breathing slowed. The modern world, the exhibition hall, the arrogant academic, the murmuring crowd began to fade. He could smell the dense, rotting vegetation of the jungle. He could hear the hum of the cicadas. "You said they were actors," Elijah said, his voice dropping into a deadly calm cadence. "You said this is a staged reproduction." "It is," Covington insisted, though a tiny flicker of unease crossed his eyes. The old man wasn't acting crazy, he was acting certain. If they are actors, Elijah challenged, lifting his head and locking eyes with Covington, then you won't mind if I introduce them to you? If this is a fake, I shouldn't know them. I shouldn't know the scars they hid under their collars or the way they stood. Covington scoffed, but the camera was rolling now. To back down would look cowardly on the evening news. Fine, Covington said, pulling a digital timer from his pocket, a tool he used for quick-fire appraisals. You want to play games? I'll give you 1 minute. Tell me about your ghost squad. When the timer rings, you leave, voluntarily, or Phil drags you out. I don't need a minute, Elijah replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses. He didn't put them on. He simply held them. He knew this picture blindly. He had traced these faces in his nightmares for half a century. Elijah looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand hit the 12. Start your watch, doctor, Elijah said. Elijah took a shallow breath. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Top row, far left. Elijah began, his voice snapping like a military snare, drum entirely devoid of the trembling weakness he had shown earlier. Thomas Rusty Callahan. Chicago. Look at his left hand resting on the rifle barrel. Covington, despite himself, leaned forward, grabbing his lobe and looking down at the small photograph. You'll see he's missing the top 2 joints of his index and middle fingers, Elijah stated rapidly. A logging accident in Oregon before the draft. He lied on his medical exam. Taught himself to pull a trigger with his ring finger. Notice how the stock of his M1 is modified, sanded down on the left side to accommodate his grip. Covington's eye widened behind the magnifying glass. The detail was microscopic, but there it was. The hand gripping the rifle was undeniably mangled exactly as described, and the wood of the weapon was visibly shaved down. A fake would never bother with a half-millimeter detail like that. Next to him, Elijah didn't stop the rhythm taking over. David O'Rourke, Brooklyn. Kid lied about his age, said he was 18. He was 16 in that picture. Look at his boots. They're too big. He stuffed newspaper in the toes because supply didn't have a size 7 in the UN-marked gear we were issued. Notice the way he's leaning against Travers. It's because he had a severe case of trench foot on his right heel and couldn't put weight on it. Covington slid the case slightly closer. He squinted. The boots on the young, terrified-looking kid were indeed clownishly large, laced incredibly tight at the ankles to keep them from slipping. The lean against the neighboring soldier was subtle but anatomically correct for someone keeping weight off a heel. 12 seconds had passed. The crowd was dead silent. The only sound was the whir of the camera lens focusing. Third man, top row, Sergeant William Travers, our squad leader. Elijah's voice cracked for a fraction of a second, then hardened. Notice the bulge under his collar on the left side. It's not a uniform defect. It's a leather pouch containing a silver St. Christopher medal. He swore it stopped a piece of shrapnel at Incheon. He never took it off. And look at his eyes. The pupils are pinned tight. He had been awake for 72 hours straight when this was taken, keeping us alive through an artillery barrage. You can see the exhaustion tremor captured in the slight blur of his left hand. Covington was sweating now. The confident smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a pale, rigid shock. The academic was looking at something he couldn't explain. The emulsion was anomalous. The paper was wrong for commercial markets, but the biological and historical reality, locked in those silver grains, was screaming truth at him. Bottom row, kneeling far right. Elijah continued the words, flowing like a river breaking a dam. 20 seconds down. Richard Doc Evans. Look at his medical bag on the ground. It's not standard issue. It's an old leather satchel he liberated from a ruined French hospital. You can just make out the faded red cross painted over a monogram. Notice his hands are stained dark. That's not shadow. That's dried blood. We took this picture exactly 3 hours after we lost our radio operator. Covington inhaled sharply. Through the loop, the dark shading on the medic's hands wasn't a trick of the lighting. It had the distinct opaque crusting of dried fluid. Next to Dr. Charles Miller, our demolition man, Elijah pressed on mercilessly. 30 seconds. He looks like he's smiling, but he's not. Look at the right side of his jaw. He caught a rifle butt to the face 3 weeks prior during a skirmish. His jaw was wired shut. He's gritting his teeth because of the pain. Notice he's holding his weapon awkwardly across his chest. He cracked 2 ribs in the same fight. Covington's hand began to shake. He dropped the loop. It clattered against the silver case. He looked up at Elijah, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The arrogant gatekeeper had been utterly dismantled by the raw, brutal weight of memory. Elijah didn't even look at Covington's shock. He was staring past him back into the jungle. 40 seconds, Elijah said softly. He pointed to the center of the bottom row, a young man with sharp eyes and a nervous, tight-lipped expression. And the man in the center, what? Elijah whispered, the harsh cadence dropping away into something deeply sorrowful. The one with the dented canteen clip to his belt and the terrified eyes. Ooh, the one who promised his mother he'd come back to work the farm. Elijah tapped the glass over the young man's face. That's me, Elijah Pendleton said. And the reason the paper stock and the emulsion don't match your textbooks, doctor, is because this photograph wasn't developed in a lab. It was developed in a captured bunker, using a mix of stolen Soviet chemicals and rainwater printed on scavenged mapping paper right before we were sent on a mission none of us were supposed to survive. Elijah looked up. The digital timer on Covington's desk clicked to 48 seconds. Your time is up, Elijah said. Sweat beaded on Dr. Alastair Covington's forehead, catching the glare of the overhead exhibition lights and ruining his matte, television-ready complexion. For a man who had spent 3 decades building an impenetrable fortress of academic superiority, the sudden absolute silence in the room felt like a physical, crushing weight. He stared at the cheap silver case, then up at the 82-year-old man who had just dismantled his professional reputation in under a minute. Elijah Pendleton had not shouted. He had not thrown a tantrum. He had simply laid out a tapestry of agonizing, hyper-specific human suffering that no faker could ever invent, let alone memorize and deliver with such bone-chilling conviction. This, Covington started, his voice suddenly lacking its rich baritone resonance. He cleared his throat desperately, trying to construct a lifeline out of his crumbling ego. This is an incredibly compelling piece of historical fiction, Mr. Pendleton. Truly. You have a gifted imagination. But as an appraiser, I must deal in empirical evidence, not emotional anecdotes. Anyone could memorize a script to match the flaws in a damaged photograph. A collective murmur of disgust rippled through the crowd. The people waiting in line were no longer bored spectators. They were a jury, and they had already reached a verdict. You're calling him a liar. A large man in a faded denim jacket yelled from 3 lines over. After what he just told you, I am applying rigorous academic standards. Covington snapped his polished veneer, finally shattering, revealing the panicked, arrogant core beneath. He looked frantically at the security guard Phil, who was now purposely looking the other way, wanting absolutely no part in removing the old man. Covington turned back to Elijah, pointing an accusing finger. You are holding up the line with a fabricated sob story. There is no proof. There is no official record of any such unit, any such men, or any such mission. If they existed, the Department of Defense would have a file. Elijah's face remained a mask of carved granite. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn, bone-handled pocket knife. Clara, sensing the shift in the room, stepped closer to her grandfather. "Grandpa, what are you doing?" she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward the rolling television camera. "Giving the doctor his empirical evidence," Elijah replied evenly. He placed the photograph case back onto the velvet appraisal mat. With agonizingly slow, arthritic fingers, he opened the blade of the pocket knife. Covington took a reflexive step back, his eyes wide. "Security," Covington yelped, finally losing his nerve. "Oh, shut up and watch, you pompous windbag," a woman in the front row hissed. Elijah ignored them all. He didn't point the knife at Covington. Instead, he wedged the thin, carbon steel blade into the microscopic seam on the back of the silver cigarette case, the side Covington hadn't even bothered to look at twice. "You told my granddaughter earlier that the hallmarks on this silver were illegible," Elijah said, his voice steady as he applied pressure to the knife handle. A sign of a cheap reproduction, you called it. You assumed the stamping was worn away by a sloppy machine. With a sharp crack, the back plate of the silver case popped loose. It wasn't a solid piece of metal at all. It was a false bottom, expertly sealed with a thin layer of lead solder that had oxidized over decades to match the silver plating perfectly. Covington froze. The cameraman, a burly guy named Greg, who realized he was filming the defining moment of his career, zoomed in tight on the table. The local news reporter, Sarah Jenkins, silently slipped her microphone closer, her eyes completely captivated. It wasn't a sloppy machine. Elijah continued, gently lifting the metal backing away. It was filed down. By me. Because if the Viet Cong caught us with an item that had a recognizable Western manufacturer's stamp, we wouldn't just be killed. We would be tortured for weeks for intelligence we didn't possess. From the hidden, shallow compartment beneath the false backing, Elijah retrieved a tiny, tightly folded square of paper. It was brittle, yellowed, and stained with dark, rusted spots that looked sickeningly similar to the stains on the medic's hands in the photograph. Elijah placed the folded paper on the velvet mat and used the edge of his knife to carefully, delicately tease it open. It was a piece of silk fabric, not paper. A survival map standard issue for aviators, but cut down to a fraction of its size. Written on the silk in faded waterproof black ink were a series of grid coordinates, and below those coordinates were 12 signatures. "Look at it," Elijah commanded, his voice echoing in the silent hall. Covington, trembling, now leaned in. He didn't need his loop. The names were right there: T. Callahan, D. O'Rourke, W. Travers, R. Evans, C. Miller, and at the very bottom, signed with a shaky, terrified hand, A. Pendleton. "We signed it the night before we crossed the border into Cambodia," Elijah said, the weight of 60 years of silence finally crashing down onto the table. "November 12th, 1968. We knew Command had wiped our names from the roster. We knew we didn't exist anymore. Travers made us sign this piece of silk. He said, if we all burn out there, one of us has to swallow this map and run. Make sure they know we were here." Elijah looked up, his pale blue eyes piercing straight through Covington's terrified facade. "I didn't swallow it," Elijah whispered, tears finally welling in his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. "I hid it in the case. I was the one who ran. I'm the only one who made it out. So Dr. Covington, you can keep your $75, but you will never ever call my brothers a fake again." Chaos erupted, but it was a hushed, reverent kind of chaos. Sarah Jenkins, the reporter, broke protocol entirely. She stepped around the velvet ropes, signaling Greg to keep the camera rolling. She bypassed Covington completely, acting as if the renowned expert had simply ceased to exist. "Mr. Pendleton," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly with raw emotion. "My name is Sarah. I'm with Channel 9. If your unit wasn't officially recorded, what were you doing in Cambodia in 1968? Why were your names wiped from the roster?" Elijah looked at the young woman. He saw the genuine hunger for truth in her eyes. He looked at Clara, his granddaughter, who was staring at him as if he were a stranger, a superhero who had hidden his cape in a mothballed closet for her entire life. "Because we were sent to clean up a political nightmare," Elijah said. The dam was broken now. The words he had choked on for over half a century poured out. They called it Operation Pale Horse. Elijah began leaning slightly on his cane, addressing the camera, the crowd, and history itself. "CIA handler by the name of Thomas Sullivan pulled our squad off the line in Da Nang. We were misfits. Guys who had disciplinary records. Guys who asked too many questions. Guys who didn't write letters home. Expendable." The exhibition hall was spellbound. Even the security guards were leaning in, completely abandoning their posts. "Sullivan told us a bomber had gone down across the border." Elijah continued, his eyes glazing over as the memories physically manifested in his mind. "Supposedly, the pilot had top-secret cipher codes. Our job was to go in completely sterile. No dog tags, no American weapons, no identifying marks. We were to find the wreckage, secure the codes, and torch the plane. We were given strict orders: avoid all contact. If we were compromised, we were to be considered rogue mercenaries. The government would deny any knowledge of our existence to avoid an international incident with Cambodia." Elijah tapped the silk map on the table. "We found the plane," Elijah said, his voice dropping an octave. "Grid coordinate 44 Alpha. It was already stripped bare. The pilot was gone. But Doc found a trail. Heavy foot traffic leading into a deep ravine system. Travers made the call to follow it." Elijah paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. Clara reached out and tightly gripped his free hand. 2 miles in, we found it," Elijah said softly. "It wasn't a cipher camp. It was a shadow prison. A Viet Cong holding facility, hidden deep in the rock formations. And inside those bamboo cages, we saw them." "Saw who, Mr. Pendleton?" Sarah asked, gently, terrified of breaking the spell. "American POWs." Elijah said the words, hitting the room like physical blows. 7 of them. Emaciated, beaten half to death. And here was the kicker. 2 of them were pilots who had been officially declared killed in action by the Pentagon 6 months prior. Their families had already received the folded flags. The military brass knew they were captured, but acknowledging a prison camp inside neutral Cambodia would have forced the politicians to act. So they buried them alive in the paperwork. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Covington was gripping the edge of his table, his knuckles white, looking physically sick. "Travers radioed Sullivan." Elijah said, his jaw tightening, the anger returning. "We told him we found our boys. We requested immediate extraction for 8 wounded men." "You know what Sullivan said over that radio?" Elijah didn't wait for an answer. He leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly snarl. "Sullivan told us we were hallucinating. He said there were no Americans at those coordinates. He ordered us to turn around, proceed to our secondary objective, and leave the area immediately. He ordered us to leave those boys in the cages to rot to protect Washington's political maneuvering." "My God," Sarah breathed. Travers clicked off the radio. Elijah said, a grim, terrifying pride flashing across his aged face. "He looked at us. He didn't issue an order. He just asked for a vote. 12 men. Misfits. We looked at those cages. We looked at each other. The vote was unanimous." Elijah picked up the photograph, staring at the 12 faces. "We breached the camp at 0200 hours. Elijah recounted the rhythm of a firefight bleeding into his words. "We killed the guards quietly. We got the cages open, but one of the POWs, he was too weak. He dropped a metal tin. The noise woke the barracks." Elijah closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights of the hall couldn't compete with the muzzle flashes burning in his memory. "It was a slaughter," Elijah whispered. 300 enemy soldiers against 12 of us. Travers took a round to the neck, holding the choke point so we could get the POWs into the jungle. Doc bled out trying to patch Travers. Rusty blew the main bridge to cut off their pursuit, but he couldn't get back across in time. One by one, they stayed behind to buy the rest of us seconds. Elijah looked at Clara. Tears were streaming freely down her face. "I was the youngest," Elijah told her, his voice breaking completely. "They forced me to take point with the rescued men. Miller shoved this silver case into my chest right before he turned back with a satchel charge. He said, 'Keep the ghosts safe, kid. Tell them we didn't run.'" Elijah wiped a single stubborn tear from his deeply lined cheek. "I got 4 of those POWs to the river extraction point. Disc." Elijah concluded, the exhaustion of the memory settling over him like a heavy blanket. "We were picked up by a rogue helicopter pilot who ignored his own command to come get us. When we got back to base, Sullivan locked me in an interrogation room for a week. He told me if I ever breathed a word about the prison, about Travers, about any of it, I would spend the rest of my life in Leavenworth for treason and going AWOL. He wiped my record. I was quietly discharged 3 weeks later with a generic completed service stamp." Elijah looked back down at the disgraced appraiser. "I hid this case in a floorboard for 40 years, Elijah said softly. "I was terrified they would come for me. I was terrified I would lose my freedom, but mostly, I was terrified that if I brought this out, some smug, overeducated fool in a suit would look at the greatest men God ever put on this earth and call them a fake." Elijah picked up the piece of silk, folded it carefully, and placed it back in the hidden compartment. He snapped the false backing into place, put the photograph inside, and closed the heavy silver lid with a resounding clack. He slid the case back into his heavy coat pocket. "You asked for empirical evidence, Doctor," Elijah said, turning away from the table. "You just got it. Come on, Clara. We're going home. These men don't belong in a museum." Elijah Pendleton leaned on his cane and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd did not just part for him. They practically stood at attention. No one spoke. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic thud of a veteran's cane walking away from a lie finally unburdened by the truth. 72 hours. That was all it took for Elijah Pendleton's agonizing confession to shatter a half-century of classified bureaucratic silence. Broadcast antennas across Boston transmitted the raw, unedited footage at exactly 6 o'clock that evening. Channel 9 station manager had initially balked at airing the segment, terrified of libel suits from Dr. Alastair Covington and potential blowback from the Department of Defense. But Sarah Jenkins had stood her ground, backed by her cameraman Greg, who flatly threatened to upload the raw memory card directly to the internet if the network spiked the story. So they ran it, and the world stopped to watch. The segment did not feature any flashy graphics or voiceover narration. Sarah simply aired the continuous, uninterrupted 4-minute clip of an 82-year-old man systematically dismantling an arrogant academic, revealing the hidden silk map and speaking the names of 12 ghosts into existence. Before the local broadcast even ended, someone had clipped the segment and posted it to a massive online forum dedicated to military history. Within 40 minutes, it hit the front page of every major social media aggregator. By midnight, Operation Pale Horse and Elijah Pendleton were the top trending topics globally. The internet, often a chaotic void of misinformation, suddenly transformed into the largest decentralized intelligence agency in human history. Amateur sleuths, retired military archivists, and thousands of veterans mobilized with a singular, terrifying focus, verifying Elijah's story. They didn't care about Covington. The appraiser's career had evaporated the second the broadcast aired. Covington had already been suspended by the Heritage Exhibition Board, and his panicked, defensive tweets claiming the video was deceptively edited were met with a tidal wave of public scorn. He was irrelevant now. The public wanted the ghosts. By dawn on Wednesday, the digital mosaic began to form, piece by agonizing piece. A retired librarian in Portland, Oregon, dug into digitized local newspapers from 1964 and found a tiny, obscure medical bulletin confirming a catastrophic logging accident at the Weyerhaeuser lumber mill. The victim, who lost 2 joints on his right hand, was named Thomas Callahan. In Brooklyn, a genealogist accessed sealed juvenile records and found a David O'Rourke who had run away from an orphanage in 1966. His listed shoe size on his intake form when he was 12 years old was a massive size 10, a biometric detail that perfectly matched Elijah's description of the kid stuffing newspaper into oversized combat boots. But the most damning piece of evidence came from a deep web military database scraper. An anonymous user located a heavily redacted flight manifest from Da Nang Air Base dated November 10, 1968. The cargo was listed as classified equipment. The pilot's notes, scribbled in the margins and missed by the government censors, read, "Transporting 12 undocumented personnel to border zone. Sullivan overseeing. Bad feeling about this." The name Thomas Sullivan was the key that turned the lock. Independent investigative journalists began relentlessly hounding the CIA press office. The agency's initial response was a standard boilerplate dismissal. "We cannot confirm or deny the existence of alleged historical operations or personnel." But the sheer volume of public pressure was suffocating. Protesters gathered outside the Pentagon holding printed screenshots of the 12 men from Elijah's silver case. Deep inside the Defense POW/MIA, accounting agency DPAA headquarters in Virginia, a seasoned investigator named Jonathan Caldwell sat at his cluttered desk, staring at his computer monitor. Caldwell had spent 30 years trying to bring missing boys home. He knew every rumor, every ghost story, every whispered myth of the Vietnam War. He had heard whispers of Black Ops rescue missions, but they were always dead ends. Caldwell replayed the Channel 9 footage for the 50th time. He watched Elijah's trembling finger point to the young medic, Doc Evans, and described the blood on his hands. Caldwell didn't see an old man telling a tall tale. He saw a survivor bearing a psychological weight that no human spine was built to carry. Caldwell picked up his secure phone and dialed a restricted number deep within the National Archives. "Frank," Caldwell said, his voice gravelly from lack of sleep, "I need you to pull a physical file, not digital. The old microfiche vaults in sub-level 4. Look for an internal intelligence memorandum from late '68, codename Pale Horse." "John, you know those files are locked behind a level 5 compartmentalized clearance," Frank whispered nervously. "If I pull that, alarms go off." "Frank, there is a man in Boston who has been carrying 12 dead men in his pocket for 50 years. Caldwell replied, his tone brooking no argument. The whole world is watching. If we don't get ahead of this, the agency is going to bury this old man to cover their tracks. Pull the file. I'll take the heat." 4 hours later, Caldwell was staring at a manila folder marked with faded red classification stamps. The ink was old, but the crimes recorded on the paper were timeless. Elijah Pendleton had not lied. Operation Pale Horse was real. The extraction of the POWs was real. And Thomas Sullivan's order to abandon them and the subsequent cover-up was documented in cold, bureaucratic typeface. Caldwell slammed the folder shut, his blood boiling. He knew exactly what he had to do. The government was preparing a massive smear campaign to discredit Elijah. Caldwell was going to make sure they failed. Rain lashed against the single-pane windows of Elijah's modest, single-story house on the outskirts of Boston. The sky was the color of bruised iron, mirroring the heavy, suffocating tension inside the living room. Elijah sat in his worn recliner, staring blankly at the muted television screen. Every news channel was running his face on a continuous loop. Clara sat on the sofa opposite him, her knees pulled up to her chest, nervously chewing on her thumbnail. They had unplugged the landline 2 days ago. Clara's cell phone was turned off, buried under a pile of blankets in the bedroom, because it hadn't stopped vibrating with calls from producers, book agents, and strangers since the broadcast. "Grandpa," Clara said softly, breaking the steady drumming of the rain. "Are you scared?" Elijah slowly turned his head. His pale blue eyes were exhausted, but the fear that had haunted him for decades was completely gone. "No, sweetheart," Elijah said, his voice a low rumble. "For 50 years I jumped at every shadow. I woke up in cold sweats thinking men in dark suits were coming to lock me in a hole because of what I knew. But the secret is out now. They can't unring the bell. The worst they can do is kill an 82-year-old man, and frankly, at my age, that's just cutting in line." Clara managed a weak, watery smile. "Don't say that." "It's true," Elijah replied, tapping his wooden cane against the floorboards. "I did my job. I kept Miller's promise. I told the world they didn't run." Suddenly, the heavy crunch of tires on wet gravel echoed from the driveway. Clara froze. She scrambled to the window, peeling back the edge of the floral curtain just enough to peer out. Her breath hitched. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's a black SUV in the driveway. Government plates. 2 men are getting out." Elijah didn't panic. He slowly pushed himself up from his recliner, leaning heavily on his cane. He felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. The final battle had arrived at his doorstep. "Stay here, Clara," Elijah commanded. He didn't raise his voice, but the tone was absolute. It was the voice of a man who had led men through hell. Elijah walked to the front hallway. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy wooden door open before the men could even ring the bell. On the porch stood 2 figures, rain dripping from the eaves around them. The man on the left was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a pristine United States Army dress uniform with the silver eagles of a colonel on his shoulders. The man on the right was civilian, late 60s, wearing a gray trench coat, his face deeply lined with an emotion Elijah couldn't immediately identify. "Elijah Pendleton?" the colonel asked. His voice was firm, but lacked the aggressive bark Elijah had expected from a government hit squad. "You found me," Elijah said coldly, gripping the door frame. "If you're here to arrest me for violating a 50-year-old non-disclosure agreement drafted by a traitor, you better brought a wheelchair. I don't walk so fast these days." The colonel shook his head slowly. "My name is Colonel Harrison, DPAA. We aren't here to arrest you, Mr. Pendleton. We're here because of the broadcast." "Of course you are." Elijah sneered, his grip tightening on his cane. "Sent to do damage control, let me guess. You're going to tell me my memory's failing. You're going to say Pale Horse was a training exercise that got out of hand. Save your breath, Colonel." "No, sir." The civilian in the trench coat suddenly spoke up. His voice cracked thick with unshed tears. He stepped forward out of the colonel's shadow into the dim porch light. Elijah narrowed his eyes, studying the man. There was something fiercely familiar about his jawline, about the set of his dark eyes. It was a face Elijah had seen before, buried beneath layers of mud, blood, and starvation. "Who are you?" Elijah demanded, a sudden cold spike of adrenaline hitting his chest. The man reached into the inside pocket of his trench coat. Elijah tensed, but the man didn't pull a weapon. He pulled out a small, incredibly battered leather journal. It was wrapped in twine, the pages yellowed and curled. "My name is Michael Dalton," the man said, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped the book. "My father was Captain Richard Dalton, United States Air Force." Elijah's breath stopped. His heart gave a violent, painful lurch against his ribs. Captain Dalton, the pilot from the second cage, the man who had been beaten so badly his left arm was completely shattered, yet who had refused to make a sound when they carried him through the jungle to avoid alerting the patrols. He made it," Elijah whispered, the tough facade completely collapsing. "I got him to the medevac bird, but Doc was gone. I didn't know if he survived the flight." Michael Dalton nodded, tears finally spilling over his eyelids, mixing with the rain blowing onto the porch. "He survived," Michael choked out. "He spent 2 years in Walter Reed putting his body back together. He lived to be 75 years old. He got to walk my sister down the aisle. He got to hold his grandchildren." Michael held out the battered leather journal toward Elijah. "He never stopped talking about the ghosts," Michael said, his voice breaking. "The government told him he was rescued by indigenous friendlies. They threatened to strip his pension if he ever claimed otherwise, but he wrote it all down here. He wrote about the 12 men with no patches who came out of the darkness, and he wrote about the kid." Michael took a step closer entirely, ignoring the rain. "He wrote that a kid no older than 20 carried him on his back for 3 miles through a swamp while returning fire," Michael said, looking directly into Elijah's wide, shocked eyes. "He wrote that he asked the kid his name right before they loaded him onto the chopper. The kid said his name was Elijah." Elijah dropped his cane. It clattered loudly against the wooden porch boards, but he didn't notice. His hands came up, trembling uncontrollably, and he took the journal from Michael Dalton. The leather felt warm, alive. "My father died 10 years ago, Mr. Pendleton," Michael said, wiping his face with the back of his hand. "His dying wish was for me to find the men who pulled him out of that cage. I've spent a decade hitting brick walls and classified redactions. I thought I would never fulfill his promise." Michael suddenly dropped to one knee on the wet porch. He bowed his head, a gesture of absolute profound reverence. "Thank you," Michael wept. "Thank you for giving my father back to us. Thank you for my family. Thank you for not running." Elijah stood frozen, the journal pressed tightly against his chest. The heavy, suffocating burden of survivor's guilt, the relentless, whispering voice in his head that had told him for 50 years that he hadn't done enough, that he shouldn't have been the one to live, finally went silent. Behind Elijah, Clara stood in the hallway, covering her mouth with her hands, sobbing quietly. Colonel Harrison stepped forward, picking up Elijah's fallen cane and gently handing it back to the old veteran. The colonel didn't look like a bureaucratic enforcer. He looked feebly humbled. "Mr. Pendleton," Colonel Harrison said gently, "the director of the DPAA sent us personally. Your broadcast triggered an internal audit. They found the Pale Horse files hidden in a restricted archive. The government is done lying, Elijah." Elijah looked from the weeping son of the man he saved to the colonel. "What does that mean?" "It means," Harrison said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "that we have the grid coordinates from your silk map, and we have the political clearance to cross the border. We are going to Cambodia, Elijah. We are going to bring your boys home." 14 time zones away from the sterile, air-conditioned lights of the Boston Heritage Exhibition Hall, the Cambodian jungle suffocated the military recovery team beneath a crushing blanket of brutal heat and dense humidity. Elijah Pendleton refused to remain in the temporary command tent. Despite the protests of military doctors and the frantic worries of his granddaughter, Clara, who had flown with him as his medical proxy, the 82-year-old veteran walked point one last time. Gnarled vines and massive banyan tree roots had completely swallowed the landscape over the last 5 decades, turning the terrain into an unrecognizable green ocean. Colonel Harrison walked a few paces behind Elijah, silently motioning for his 20-man defense POW/MIA accounting agency DPAA excavation team to hold their pace. The forensic anthropologists, led by a seasoned specialist named Dr. Gregory Hayes, carried ground-penetrating radar equipment and heavy digging tools, their faces tight with a mixture of exhaustion and profound awe. They were following a ghost. "The topographical maps say the ravine should be another click north," Dr. Hayes murmured, wiping a thick layer of sweat from his eyes. "But the monsoons over the last 50 years have drastically altered the water flow. The riverbed completely shifted." Elijah stopped, leaning heavily on a reinforced aluminum trekking pole the medics had issued him. His breathing was labored, his chest rising and falling in sharp, jagged rhythms. He closed his eyes, shutting out the modern GPS devices and satellite imagery the soldiers were relying on. He didn't need satellites. He let the phantom sounds of 1968 wash over him. The screams, the deafening chatter of AK-47 fire, the smell of cordite and burning bamboo. "Turn off the GPS." Elijah rasped, his voice cutting through the hum of the jungle insects. He pointed a trembling, spotted hand toward a seemingly impenetrable wall of jagged limestone and thick elephant grass to their left. "The maps are wrong. The river shifted, but the rocks didn't. Rusty blew the suspension bridge right there. The anchor bolts will still be in the stone." Colonel Harrison signaled his point man. 2 soldiers with machetes hacked through the dense foliage. Minutes later, a sharp whistle echoed back. "Colonel," a soldier shouted, "we have oxidized metal embedded in the limestone face-old suspension cables, rusted to dust, but the drill holes are here." A collective shiver ran down the spines of the DPAA team, completely ignoring the oppressive heat. The old man was flawlessly navigating a blind wilderness purely by the scars left on his soul. "Bring him up," Harrison ordered softly. Elijah shuffled forward, his boots sinking into the soft, decaying jungle floor. As they rounded the limestone outcropping, the earth abruptly dropped away into a steep, shadowed gorge. This was the bottleneck. This was where Sergeant William Travers had ordered the misfits to hold the line so Elijah could get the broken POWs to the river. "They're here," Elijah whispered, his knees finally buckling. Colonel Harrison caught him before he hit the ground. Gently lowering the old veteran to a sitting position on a moss-covered log, Elijah buried his face in his trembling hands. "They never made it past this choke point. I can still hear them." Dr. Hayes immediately deployed his team. They set up a grid, running the ground-penetrating radar over the dense soil. For 3 agonizing hours, the only sounds were the beeps of the machinery and the soft scrape of trowels against the earth. Elijah sat silently, Clara kneeling beside him, holding his hand. Then, a young forensic technician named Davis gasped. "Dr. Hayes," Davis called out, his voice cracking. "Grid Sector 4, 2 meters down. I have an anomaly." Hayes rushed over, falling to his knees in the mud. He took a soft, bristled brush and delicately swept away the dark, wet earth. He worked with the excruciating precision of a surgeon. Slowly, the mud yielded to something unnatural, something metallic. Hayes reached into the earth with gloved hands and gently lifted the object into the dappled jungle sunlight. It was a rusted, ruined M1 Garand rifle stock. But it was the left side of the wood that made every soldier in the clearing stop breathing. Ooh, the wood had been visibly sanded down, modified decades ago, to accommodate a missing ring and index finger. Elijah looked up. Tears silently tracked through the dirt on his weathered cheeks. "Thomas Callahan," Elijah said, his voice breaking. "Rusty, keep digging," Colonel Harrison ordered, removing his cap and holding it over his heart. "Bring them all up." Over the next 4 days, the DPAA team meticulously unearthed the battlefield. They did not just find bone fragments, they found the undeniable empirical truth of Operation Pale Horse. They uncovered a pair of rotting boots tightly laced around the ankles, stuffed with the disintegrated remnants of newspaper. David O'Rourke, the 16-year-old kid. They found a shattered jawbone alongside 2 cracked ribs laying near the rusted remains of a satchel-charged Charles Miller. And on the final day of the excavation, Dr. Hayes called Elijah over to a shallow depression near the edge of the gorge. Hayes stepped back, allowing the old man to look down. Resting in the center of the excavated square of earth, gleaming dully against the dark mud, was a tarnished silver St. Christopher medal. It was still attached to a rotted leather cord, resting perfectly over the sternum of the skeletal remains beneath it. Elijah dropped to his knees. He reached out and lightly touched the silver medal. "Sergeant," Elijah whispered, closing his eyes as a sob finally tore free from his chest. "I brought them back. I told them you didn't run Travers. I told them." Colonel Harrison knelt in the mud beside the weeping 82-year-old man. He placed a steady, reassuring hand on Elijah's shoulder. "We have them, Elijah. All 11. Your watch is over, soldier. We are going home." Accountability did not arrive in the jungle. It arrived 4 weeks later in a heavily guarded, wood-paneled hearing room on Capitol Hill. The public outrage ignited by Elijah Pendleton's broadcast had not faded. It had evolved into a furious, unstoppable inferno. The revelation that American POWs had been abandoned to protect political optics forced the United States Senate to convene an emergency televised select committee. Subpoenas were issued, doors were kicked open, and classified servers were raided by furious Department of Justice investigators. The target was Thomas Sullivan. Sullivan was now 88 years old, living a life of quiet, obscenely wealthy luxury in Georgetown as a retired intelligence director. When he was wheeled into the Senate hearing room, flanked by 4 expensive defense attorneys, he looked frail, harmless, and deeply inconvenienced. He had spent his entire life burying bodies and destroying documents. He was utterly confident no paper trail existed to connect him to the slaughter in Cambodia. "Senators," Sullivan rasped into the microphone, offering a condescending, grandfatherly smile. "I understand the emotional weight of Mr. Pendleton's tall tales. Combat trauma is a terrible thing, but there was no Operation Pale Horse. I never issued an order to abandon captured personnel. There is no official record, no CIA directive, no signature proving I had any involvement in this alleged fantasy." Sullivan's lead attorney smirked. "You cannot convict a man on the ghost stories of an elderly veteran seeking his 15 minutes of fame." The chairman of the committee, a stern-faced senator from Ohio, did not look at the attorney. He looked toward the back doors of the chamber. "Postal, the committee calls Elijah Pendleton to the floor," the chairman announced. The heavy oak doors swung open. Elijah walked in wearing a crisp, dark suit Clara had bought for him. He leaned on his cane, his posture rigidly straight. He walked past the banks of flashing cameras, past the packed gallery of veterans who stood in silent uniform, respect as he passed. He took his seat at the witness table, directly adjacent to Thomas Sullivan. Sullivan refused to look at him. "Mr. Pendleton," the chairman said gently, "Mr. Sullivan claims there is absolutely no physical record connecting him to your unit, or to the order to abandon the POWs. Do you have anything to add to your previous statements?" Elijah didn't speak into the microphone immediately. He reached into his jacket pocket. He did not pull out the silver cigarette case. Instead, he pulled out a clear archival evidence bag provided by the FBI. Inside the bag was the brittle, yellowed silk map he had kept hidden for 50 years. "Before we crossed the border, my Sergeant William Travers made us sign this map," Elijah said, his voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "He knew command was going to erase us. He wanted proof we existed. A piece of cloth signed by rogue soldiers proves nothing about my client's involvement." Sullivan's attorney interrupted loudly. "I'm not finished." Elijah said, his tone flashing with the deadly authority of a combat veteran, silencing a green recruit. He turned his head and locked his pale blue eyes onto Thomas Sullivan. "You were arrogant, Sullivan. You thought we were stupid, expendable grunts who didn't know how the intelligence game worked. But Travers wasn't stupid." Elijah tapped the plastic evidence bag. "Travers didn't just steal the map from the supply depot." Elijah continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent chamber. "He stole it directly off your desk in the command tent in Da Nang while you were briefing the general. Turn the bag over, Mr. Chairman." A bailiff carefully took the bag from Elijah and handed it to the committee chairman. The senator flipped the clear plastic over. "When an intelligence officer checks out a classified evasion map," Elijah explained, "they are required to log it. Travers knew that map had your personal CIA routing cipher and your signature stamped on the back in ultraviolet security ink. We didn't just sign our names to a piece of silk, Sullivan. We signed our names directly over your authorization code." The chairman signaled a technician. The lights in the hearing room dimmed. An investigator stepped forward with an ultraviolet light wand and swept it over the back of the silk map. A collective gasp echoed through the room, captured perfectly by the C-SPAN cameras. Glowing brightly in the darkness beneath the 12 faded signatures of the Ghost Squad was the undeniable cryptographic stamp of the Central Intelligence Agency. And right below it, illuminated in stark, undeniable neon blue, was the signature authorized by T. Sullivan, Regional Director of Operations. Sullivan's face drained of all blood. His grandfatherly facade collapsed, replaced by the sheer naked terror of a man watching the trap close on his throat. His expensive attorneys frantically began whispering to each other, realizing their client had just been caught in a lie of treasonous proportions. "You left them to die," Elijah said softly, leaning closer to Sullivan's microphone so the entire world could hear him. "You left my brothers in the dirt, but they found their way back, and they brought you down." 2 days later, Thomas Sullivan was formally indicted on multiple counts of treason, perjury, and conspiracy to conceal prisoners of war. The gatekeeper who had hidden the truth was finally locked behind the gates of a federal penitentiary. But for Elijah, the true victory came a week later. A heavy, mournful rain fell over Arlington National Cemetery. The gray sky matched the solemnity of the occasion. 11 horse-drawn caissons rolled slowly down the paved pathways, each carrying a flag-draped casket. Elijah Pendleton stood at the edge of the manicured green grass, wearing a heavy wool coat against the chill. Beside him stood Clara, tears freely rolling down her face, and standing shoulder to shoulder with Elijah was Michael Dalton, the son of the POW Elijah had carried out of the jungle half a century ago. Hundreds of people, veterans, active duty soldiers, and citizens who had heard the story, lined the hills, standing in absolute reverent silence. As the honor guard fired the final 3-volley salute, the sharp cracks echoing over the rolling hills of Arlington, Elijah stepped forward. He walked to the freshly turned earth of the center grave. The headstone was brilliant, pristine white marble. It read, "Sergeant William Travers. He did not run." Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out the battered silver cigarette case. He traced the dent on the bottom left corner with his thumb one last time. He didn't need to look at the tin type inside anymore. He didn't need the silver casing to protect his memories. The world knew their names now. The ghosts were finally at rest. Elijah gently placed the silver case on top of the marble headstone. He took a half-step back, snapped his boots together, and raised his trembling right hand in a crisp, perfect salute. "Rest easy, boys," Elijah whispered into the wind. "I'll take the watch from here." If Elijah's incredible stand against arrogance gave you chills, do not let this story fade into history. Hit that like button right now to honor the forgotten heroes who walked in the shadows so we could live in the light. Share this video with anyone who appreciates true grit and the power of a veteran's memory. And make sure you subscribe and click the bell icon so you never miss out on these hidden heart-stopping stories of real-life courage. What did you think of the specialist's reaction? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Elijah Pendleton, Alistair Covington, Clara Pendleton.